Good afternoon. My name is Taisei Matsuki, the PMR Secretariat. So now it's 2 p.m. in Singapore time. We would like to start the carbon pricing initiative in East Asia and Pacific region webinar from now. But thank you very much for attending from all over the world. Thanks a lot. So before going to the further, I'd like to quickly explain the housekeeping stuff. The microphones will be muted for the duration of the event. And if you cannot hear the speakers, select the More Options icon and choose your preferred audio output. The chat option will be disabled. To pose a question to panelists, select the Q&A icon, please. And this webinar will be recorded and available for on-demand viewing on the PMR website. Once the event concludes, select the Leave button to exit. Okay, Francis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Taisei. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Ghesquiere. I'm the practice manager for urban disaster risk management, land and geospatial at the World Bank here in East Asia. And I'm also the coordinator of the climate support team for the region. Let me start by congratulating the Partnership for Market Readiness, the PMR team, not just for organizing this seminar, but for celebrating a decade of rich and varied experience in helping develop readiness in more than 20 countries, actually 23 countries. The PMR is now winding down with the formal closing scheduled for June 2021, which is just a month away. But it will be replaced by the Partnership for Market Implementation, the PMI, which is the natural next step in setting up carbon pricing mechanism, and in fact, which is a demonstration of the success of the PMR program. I will ask everybody to mute. I think some of the speakers are not yet speakers, so we can start this webinar. Today's webinar aims to showcase the achievements of countries supported by the PMR in recent years. It will hopefully give you insights on the development and deployment of carbon pricing policies and instruments. We will start with a recorded opening address from Venkat Putti, the program manager of the PMR Secretariat at the World Bank. We will then have presentation from 5 guest speakers from 5 different countries supported by PMR in recent years: China, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, and Vietnam. I will introduce each speaker as we go along before each of them intervene. And each speakers will then have 10 minutes to present, 10 minutes no more, so that we have time for Q&A. And as Taisei indicated, please ask your question in the Q&A function of the WebEx. There are quite a lot of participants in this webinar, and so that's the most effective way. I will try to pick questions as they come and pass them to the different speaker. Throughout the webinar, we'll have an illustrator translating what she hears from this conversation, and we'll have the pleasure of discovering her interpretation just before the closing. Our first speakers today is Mr. Wang. Mr. Wang is from China, where he is a lead management consultant at ICF Beijing, with more than 15 years of experience working on climate change across public and private sector. Mr. Wang is one of China's leading specialists over the development of carbon pricing policies, transition toward low carbon society, and promotion of clean energy. He will tell us about PMR's work supporting in particular the private sector in China. Over to you, Mr. Wang.
Thank you, Francis. Just double check, can you hear me?
We can hear you very well.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and appreciate invitation of World Bank PMR Secretary. And yeah, it's my big honor to share some opinions about PMR with you. Just a short disclaimer, what I'm going to present is only my personal opinion and never be on behalf of Chinese government, because I have led the PMR program for several years. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I'll give you an outline of PMR support for China's carbon market development. So on top of this slide, you can see key milestones I summarized. In recalling 2011 January, the China government has submitted expression of interest to PMR. And in October 2012, China's MRP market readiness proposal, and the first draft has been submitted to the member conference of PMR. And after discussion and consultation and improvements in March 2013, the final proposal has been approved, and the China has received allocation of implementing funding, which was a big support for China's carbon market development. So if we look at the key areas the PMR is supporting, I would separate mainly two sections. The one section is original, is some activities in original MRP, and the most important thing to study some core components of Chinese nationwide ETS, including coverage, cap setting, allocation methodologies, and some supplementary mechanisms, and also to support study on legal framework and supervision system, MR-based system, and improvements of registry. Besides, PMR also supported two specific studies, which will be very important for Chinese ETS, including how about the role of state-owned enterprises, which will be key players in Chinese market, and participation of power sector in Chinese national market. And apart from these studies, the PMR also supported China to do some case studies at the regional level, and 6 key regions and provinces are selected for these regional studies. And so based on this original MRP, and I don't know, the PMR is continuing supporting China to do some additional activities, including how to extend study on sectoral emissions benchmarks for allowance allocation, and how to do monitoring and evaluation of construction and maintaining the registry and exchange platform, and also study about the regulatory of national ETS, and study of the interaction between carbon markets and climate finance policies, and study of national ETS production developing a roadmap, and also study of good practice on carbon trading. Anyway, these additional activities are quite aligned with Chinese national ETS development, and to reflect the latest demands of Chinese carbon market. Yeah, as the chair mentioned before this webinar, next stage, the PMR implementation will go to PMI stage, and I'm quite confident with the launch of Chinese carbon market, and the PMI of China will achieve more we will have more achievement. Next slide. So if we look at some key achievements, I'd say China has achieved a lot of milestone progresses, but due to time constraints, I just highlighted several achievements I think will be very, very useful to share. The first achievement is, China will launch its nationwide ETS this year. The date has been secured by the end of June. So next month, you will see China will have a very promising launch event. And I don't know, Beijing, Shanghai, and Hubei will have a joint launch event there. Several milestone progresses has been achieved in regard to legislation of Chinese ETS with support of PMR. For example, Interior Method on Administration of Carbon Emission Treaty has been issued by Ministry of Ecology and Environment of China last December, and which provided a very good basis for operation of Chinese market at the first stage. And furtherly, a higher level of draft of interior regulations on the administration of carbon emission treaty has been released by MEE this May for public consultation. And the next step, based on comments received, the Chinese government is going to revise and issue this high-level regulation later. And also, you can see after a big efforts, our prototype of Chinese nationwide ETS is forged very well. For example, a multi-tiered governance structure covering national, provincial, and municipal county level has been established in the regulation. And coverage, the power sector will be covered as the first sector. Allowance allocation plan has been released very well, and you can check very detailed allocation program like methodologies, factors, etc. in this plan. Monitoring, MRV monitoring reporting verification standards has been issued by Chinese government, and which provides a good basis for data credibility. The registry and treaty right now, Hubei and Shanghai are working respectively readiness of registry and exchange platform, and they will be linked to each other when Chinese ETS is launched. Compliance, Chinese government also released the compliance requirements for 2019 and 2020, and require covered entity to surrender their allowances in the timeline and in the process regulated by Chinese government. Offsetting was also mentioned in regulation, and at maximum 5% allowance can be offsetted by CCER, China Certified Emission Reduction. So generally, overall, you can see the Chinese government, the Chinese ETS is in a good shape to move forward. Next slide, please.
Just 1 minute left.
I'll be very quick. So in talking about private sector's perspective to the carbon pricing instruments, and I just summarized several key elements I think were very important policy position. And under the context of carbon neutrality, the private sector is quite confident the carbon price will play more and more important role. And data credibility, private sector will pay high attention on data credibility because it will relate to carbon assets value. And governance, we are expecting Chinese governments do a very big role as a watchdog instead of game player. And carbon pricing instruments will definitely provide a good business incentive to business development to encourage private sector to develop a decarbonized business models. Competitiveness, impacts of the impact about on competitiveness will be addressed very well in our perspective. And finally, carbon asset management is becoming more and more important for private sector. And you can see now in China, and many enterprises and the companies have established their carbon asset management system. Okay, so final slide, you can find my email and my mobile. And yeah, now I'm working for ICF Consulting, and we are delighted to explore any cooperation opportunities with you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wang. We're all very, very excited to see the launch of the China nationwide ETS system next month. I think given the importance of China in the world economy and the growing leadership role that China is taking, everybody is looking at that market and the impact it will have and whether it can emulate other markets around the world. Our next speakers is Mr. Dida Gardera. Mr. Gardera is from Indonesia, where he is currently Assistant Deputy Minister for Agriculture, Pharmacy and Tourism at the Coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs. Among his multiple attributions, and I can tell you his biography was very long, so I had to pick a few that are relevant here. Mr. Gardera managed several international cooperation programs, namely the Partnership for Market Readiness with the World Bank, the Clean Energy Finance and Investment Program with the OECD, and working on Article 6, the Article 6 support facility with the ADB, and then designing Article 6 policy and approaches with probably many different agencies. Mr. Gardera, we look forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Francis, and thanks also to PMR's team, Venkat, Taisei for inviting me to share Indonesian progress in carbon pricing development. Next slide, please. With the expected outcomes to improve Indonesia readiness in designing and implementing carbon pricing instruments in Indonesia. So PMR Indonesia works in 3 areas within the power and industry sectors, which are first greenhouse gases emission profiling, and then we also been supported in developing the MRV system in Indonesia, and the third one carbon pricing instrument development and piloting. So in general, we have 5 results, you can say like that. First, we have the update emission profile in power and in 8 energy intensive subsectors industries. And also we have already improved our MRV system. And then, as Venkat mentioned, just in March, we launched the pilot for emission trading system in power sectors. And also we have another instrument for carbon pricing, which is carbon crediting mechanism, or we call Indonesia Certified Emission Reductions. We also right now developing the carbon pricing general framework for Indonesia related to the development of more detailed policy framework. And then, of course, we have some capacity building activities. Next slide, please. Yeah, achievement to date during the program implementation, we have already engaged 140 power park companies with almost 5,000 power plants units, more than 300 industries in the 8 energy intensive industry subsectors, 16 private sectors associations, and we conducted almost 170 meetings, workshop, training, and so on and so forth, involving more than 550 professionals and 600 other participants. So the PMRs, not only as a program or project, is already kind of a common platform in developing carbon pricing in Indonesia. So we have some result, as already mentioned previously, and the big achievement for Indonesia is the run of ETS pilot, and hopefully within one or the latest 2024, we already run the compulsory of ETS. Next slide, please. Yeah, carbon pricing instrument in Indonesia is takes an important role to assist Indonesia in mobilizing non-party stakeholders, particularly private sectors, to participate and of course invest in climate change mitigations. So we'll support Indonesia to achieve their NDCs target with more cost effectively and contribute to resource efficiency, and in general will support the low carbon development in Indonesia. So already past the phase of readiness, so we are have more capacity in technical terms and also in the policy and institutional arrangement. Hopefully within the next phase, the supporting by the PMI program, so we'll enhance in operational technical aspects. Of course, in the policy will be more certain in Indonesia, and integrate all the carbon pricing instrument in line with our national development. Hopefully within that, we will gain the market trust. We will embrace all stakeholder participations, and finally, in line with the achievement of NDC, will support the low carbon development or decarbonization Indonesia. I will stop there, so I will wait the response from the audience in the discussion later. Thank you. Back to you, Francis.
Thank you very much, Dida. This is very interesting. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. I have quite a few myself, so I look forward to the Q&A part of this webinar. Our next speaker will be Dr. Muanjit Chamsilpa. Dr. Muanjit is from Thailand, where she is a technical expert in the Carbon Market and Innovation Promotion Office of Thailand's Greenhouse Gas Management Organization. Dr. Muanjit has worked with the Thailand PMR project and program since 2014, so we can say she's an expert. She also has experience developing GHG mitigation project for Thailand's voluntary emission reduction program. She looked in particular at alternative energy project and energy efficiency project. Dr. Muanjit, over to you.
Thank you very much, sir. Sawadee. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Today, I'd like to present carbon pricing initiative in Thailand. You can see CPI readiness preparation of Thailand under the PMR support consists of 3 components. The first one is Energy Performance Certificate or EPC scheme with the concept voluntary, target, and reward. We focus on the 11 intensive energy consuming sectors. There are 7 outputs of these components, such as legal frameworks for Thailand EPC, electronic MRV system, specific energy consumption databases of the 11 sectors for energy baseline and target setting, and mobile application low carbon building for knowledge dissemination. The second component is Low Carbon City Program, or LCC, which aims to support municipalities or communities to shift toward a low carbon society by implementing greenhouse gas emission reduction activities. We focus on developing emission profile of the cities, identify potential emission reduction, and develop local greenhouse gas abatement plans and guidelines. And some mitigation projects of the pilot municipalities could apply to the domestic crediting mechanism named Thailand Voluntary Emission Reduction Program, or TVER. We also developed the mobile application Low Carbon City as a simple tool to evaluate greenhouse gas emissions of city. And the third one is development of legal frameworks for establishing the ETS in Thailand and greenhouse gas reporting system for ETS. For the other elements of ETS, we spend national budget to study and develop for more than 10 years, since 2009. Next slide, please. This slide shows key deliverables or indicators of the three components of Thailand PMR. We delivered the EPC package to the Ministry of Energy as they are policymakers. Now it is in consideration process for initiative the pilot EPC in Thailand in the future. For the LCC, the 25 pilot municipalities could integrate greenhouse gas emission inventory, forecast of the emission trend, potentials of emission reduction, and the abatement plans activities into their master plan. And now they continue to implement these activities. And we already proposed the policy recommendation on legal frameworks for Thailand ETS establishment to TGO Executive Board for its consideration. Focusing on linkage of these CPIs and the domestic carbon market, implementation of the EPC scheme will enhance effective energy consumption of the designated factory and buildings in Thailand. The outcomes of the EPC will be good preparation for implementation of Thailand ETS in the future. The LCC program's outcome could develop to greenhouse gas mitigation projects, TVERs, and the project's carbon credits could be traded in the carbon market. Next slide, please. My last slide is conclusion of the CPI's role in the country's decarbonization goals. You can see on the top, Thailand has the National Economic and Social Development Plan, the National Strategic Plan, and the National Reform Plan that focus on leading country to low carbon society, setting up target for greenhouse gas reduction, formulating medium and long-term action plans for voluntary greenhouse gas mitigation, and conducting market research to promote economic incentives. So CPI's readiness preparation from the PMR support and co-financing with national budget could strongly support these countries' goals. We also have CPI implementation plans as shown in the red box. And we hope that we will get continuous support from the PMI of the World Bank. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohanjit. I'm impressed that you managed to present such a broad program in just 7 minutes. That's quite an achievement. I take note that, and you are probably one of the most advanced countries in the region engaging with cities, which is an area where, at least at the World Bank, we're very interested to support. And so I'm sure you will get some phone calls from some of my colleagues to learn from your experience. Our next speaker is Ms. Paula Alvarez. Ms. Alvarez is from the Philippines, and I wonder if I even need to present her because she is quite a frequent speaker at World Bank event. She's currently the Assistant Secretary for International Finance and Special Projects, and the official spokesperson and head of communication at the Department of Finance in the Philippines. As Assistant Secretary, she handles sustainable and climate finance, as well as disaster risk finance, as well as special projects such as the Interagency Task Force on Marawi Rehabilitation and the Interagency Task Force on Infectious Disease, including related to COVID-19. So thank you very much, Ms. Alvarez, for being with us today. You're a very busy person, but the Philippines is also making progress in this agenda, and so we're very keen to hear from your experience. Over to you, Ms. Alvarez.
Thank you, Francis, and good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone. And thank you for having the Philippines in this PMR sessions and updating and our winding down. So to start with, could I have the first slide, please? Next slide. Okay, so before we go into the outline of what we have been doing with the PMR, we just wanted to set the context that when we started with the PMR support, the concept of carbon pricing instruments was very vague in terms of the Philippines. So there were not a lot of people who understood what they were for and how we were actually supposed to utilize them. A lot of government officials, for example, like members of Congress and members of the executive branch as well, only knew about carbon tax. And this didn't sit well, since when we started developing the PMR support, we just increased the prices of oil in the Philippines. So we really had to set the context and have the concept of carbon pricing instruments understood by a lot of different stakeholders. So that's really where Taisei and Stephen and the other members of the PMR really did all the legwork. So for the Philippines, we had three components in general. So since we were not yet as advanced as other markets, for example, like Thailand, we really had to break it down. So first, we had a component on identifying carbon pricing instruments for the energy and transportation sectors. And we had to do this in relation to the NDC. Since the NDC at that time was undergoing the review and the conceptualization, we had to put the carbon pricing instrument in such a context that other government agencies would see the benefit or the support or use of carbon pricing instruments. So we started first with the energy and transportation sectors because they were one of those who did not really grasp yet how we were supposed to compute, for example, our mitigation targets in relation to the energy and transportation sector. And then the second component was, as I was mentioning earlier, we had to do a lot of capacity building, especially for the private stakeholders in relation to the energy and transport sector, because carbon pricing instruments is something that's not talked about every day, especially in this sector. So a breakdown of the different kinds, like what is most appropriate and what could we do and how can this actually help in terms of low carbon development, because most of the messaging that we're coming across was that imposing carbon pricing instruments would just make the cost of energy and the cost of fuel more expensive, not taking into consideration the societal benefits. So we really had to do a lot of those. And for the third component, we had a support for the management unit. So next slide, please. So we had to do an options and analytics paper in relation to energy and transport sector. So this was actually a big help in terms of understanding how we will commit in our NDC for purposes of low carbon development. So the energy and the transport sector worked closely with the team to incorporate how business as usual would be in comparison to imposing carbon pricing instruments and what the best option for a carbon pricing instrument would be. So we had to go through this because, as I said earlier, we just increased taxes in oil, but this type of taxes was an excise tax. It was a tax on privilege, or it was a tax on the wealthy who used a majority of the imported oil. It didn't really take carbon emissions into consideration. So we had to come with an analytics paper to show that taxes are not the only form of carbon pricing instruments. and that there are other means to explore that could actually help us in not just achieving our NDC targets of a lower carbon emission, but at the same time, increasing investments alternatively in energy efficiency and renewable energy investments. So this was very much a paper that was worked. I think we had some time working on this paper because we had to have a lot of approvals, especially from the Energy Secretary, because he didn't want to tinker with the idea of a higher price of energy for the Philippines, since we don't have energy security as of the moment. So this paper really helped in providing that leverage or providing that understanding. So next slide, please. Okay, so the CPI's role in the country's decarbonization goals, as I have said earlier, the Philippines is a very is not as sophisticated yet as a market in relation to other Southeast Asian countries, and we only contribute 0.33% of the world share of GHG emissions. But we see that the growing pattern in consumption, the population, and the energy requirements in the long run would actually increase our carbon emissions. So that's when we started to actually look into the proper carbon pricing instrument. And for the Philippines, we follow the renewable energy plan provided by the Department of Energy, and we agreed to come to support an intensity-based ETS, primarily focused on the power sector. And the reason for this is because in terms of implementation, for example, the energy sector is the most advanced in terms of computing how much carbon emissions is attached in relation to fuel or in relation to using coal fire power plants. But in terms of other sectors, it's very hard for us to measure because we don't have yet monitoring and counting facility for us to properly provide for the platform to do this energy trading scheme. However, this emissions trading scheme. However, we already included in our NDC submission that as a parallel to improving investments in renewable energy, we will, once we already have the number of investments required to have energy security, we would start doing the carbon pricing instruments. And as of the moment, there are a lot of carbon pricing instruments already filed in both houses of Congress. And we're looking into how to help our legislators better understand how ETS could be utilized as well in terms of the recovery from the pandemic. So I think this is my last slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so that ends my presentation. And thank you for having us. And we will look forward to your questions later.
Thank you very much, Ms. Alvarez. It's good to see that the Philippines is really ramping up. There are, of course, elections coming in about a year, but I think there's kind of consensus among the political class that this is an area that needs to be addressed. So I think we can be optimistic. Our next speaker is Dr. Luong Quang Huy. Dr. Huy is from Vietnam, and where he's the director of the GHG emission reduction and ozone layer protection at the Department of Climate Change in the Ministry of Natural Resource and Environment in Vietnam. And he will tell us about the experience in Vietnam. Over to you, Dr. Huy.
Thank you very much, Francis, and good morning, good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me for this session. And next slide, please. First of all, I'd like to present to you what the PMR support to Vietnam, and it actually started quite early in 2012 for preparation, and were formally started by 2015 and 2016, and it just ended last year. And it started in Vietnam when the country is very new to carbon pricing, even though we have some experience with the CDM and later on in JCM. those crediting mechanism at a multilateral and bilateral level. But for other CPIs or MBI is very new to us. So with the PMR support is to strengthen the capacity of first of all line ministries involved and also the private sector to understand the carbon pricing approaches and supporting us for building blocks, develop different building blocks for market-based instruments, and trying to develop our carbon pricing policy through a focus on evaluating carbon pricing options for Vietnam and assess and developing the technical policy and management tools available to the government of Vietnam. And of course, that we also do a couple of pilots in steel production and solid waste management sectors, which would be going to the next stage, which I will mention in a minute. Next slide, please. Well, with 3 different components under the PMR, probably the best achievement of the PMR is to contribute very significantly into the development of law on environmental protection. First, we have a dedicated chapter on climate change, in which we have an article on the development of carbon market, a domestic carbon market. The term we use in Vietnam here is a carbon market, but that can be understood as all carbon pricing instruments that can be used. And in fact, the Article 139 of our law on environmental protection just issued last year and will be going into effect by the 1st of January next year, provided very clearly on the ETS and also national crediting mechanism. And currently that we are based on the results and the findings of the PMR project, that we are working on the guiding decree and other legal documents at the national level and also sectoral level to implement the law on environmental protection, which I will mention on the roadmap in a minute. And the second component of the PMR project is to pilot on the steel production and solid waste management sector, as I mentioned earlier, and that develop a number of tools, including the database, MRV system, and the sectoral policies for the steel and solid waste sector. And the third option, which is equally important, is to develop a number of training materials, which in fact we are in the printing process now for the final products, and we have a massive interest from the private sector and also other stakeholders to ask us for the book that we are printing out of the findings from the PMR projects. And during the course of about almost 3 years, that we have trained thousands of policymakers throughout the country on the carbon pricing, and also with some example from steel production and solid waste management sector, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. With the CPI role in the country decarbonization goals, and also last year in September, we submitted our updated NDC, in which that indicated the use of carbon pricing instruments to enhance ambition and effectiveness of our GHG emission reduction efforts, especially in energy consuming subsectors such as steel, cement, building, thermal energy production. And I would like to stress that the CPIs will contribute to the achievement of our unconditional goal as we committed within the NDC, which is a 9% compared to the BU to 2030. And well, as I mentioned in the law already, that we have at least 2, the carbon pricing instrument, which is ETS and crediting mechanism, shall be used. And at the moment, we're developing the guiding document, which is the roadmap for the national crediting mechanism and the ETS in Vietnam. And well, with all those carbon pricing instruments that are provided in the law and also in the upcoming decree and other legal documents. Private sector is showing a very high interest, and we are working with the Vietnam Chamber for Commerce and Industry, which is actually association for business sector to work on that, and we look forward to work with them to use the CPIs to achieve the conditional targets for our GHG emission reduction as we committed in the NDC, and also in our national plan for the GHG emission reduction, which will be issued next year. Next slide, please. And that is my last slide here, which we are thinking about how we're gonna introduce CPIs in Vietnam. Of course, as it's very new, but we try to catch up. And first of all, with the national crediting program, because of the COVID-19, what we expected that some guidance from UNFCCC on Article 6 mechanism has not come out yet, but hopefully by end of this year, scope 26. And with it or without it, we're still developing our legal documents, policies to introduce a national crediting mechanism, starting with the pilot phase in 2024, and which would last for a couple of years. And then from 2027 onwards, it will be in full voluntary domestic assessing scheme. And of course, for implementation of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And we're thinking about calling it VIVA compared to others, TIVA or JVA in other countries. And another CPI is the emission trading scheme, which is also a provision in the law, and which would require a longer time for preparation and pilot. And we're thinking about from now to 2025 to develop the legal foundation for the ETS, and that would include the involvement of relevant line ministries and also private sector, especially Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Planning Investment, to ensure that while the operational ETS in Vietnam as a domestic ETS. And we would also spend a couple of years in 26 and 27 to pilot voluntary ETS. In fact, it's not really voluntary, but it's already provided in the law that the number of large emitters will be included in the ETS, and they will be provided allowance and to start the ETS immediately by 2026. And from 2027 or 2028 onwards, that will be a full operation of the ETS in Vietnam. And with the PMR and the upcoming PMI, then we believe that our intention and also our goals within the NDC and our legal documents will be achieved. And so that pretty much is, thank you very much, that I will be happy to answer any questions and comments later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hui. This is quite impressive and quite ambitious, I must say. And we hopefully the PMI program can help you in this process. I want to thank all the speakers because we've managed to do all the presentation in the imparted time, which is fantastic. That leaves us a bit more than 20 minutes for question and answers. So I will encourage people to ask your question in the Q&A section of the WebEx. So we have more than 50 participants today, so that's the best way to manage the process. We already have a few questions in the Q&A section. First one is from Barjor Mehta, who's a staff at the World Bank, and it's a question for you, Mr. Wang. Barjor is asking that while initial coverage of the ETS system in China will be on the energy sector, he's asking what other sector do you think are likely to be included in the near future, and in particularly the 14-15 years plan? And this question is to you, but I think we can then open it to other participants. Dida, you probably have a sense in Indonesia what sector are likely to participate in ETS markets once they emerge in Indonesia, and anybody else who wants to step in, please feel free to jump in. Over to you, Dr. Wang.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you for this question. So yeah, what I hear about is Chinese government is actually considering to scale up the coverage of ETS. And one consideration is to cover several more emission-intensive sectors during the 14 5-year plan, which is from 2021 to 2025, including steel, chemical, and low ferrous metal. They are outlining efforts to study like allowance allocation methodology for these several sectors. Yeah, that's will be possible during this time. If we look furtherly, for example, next 5-year plan periods, they may come more sectors like aviation, paper, etc. So yeah, we do look forward to more sectors to be covered by Chinese ETS.
Maybe before moving to Dida, I see he's already ready to answer, but maybe a question linked to this one is, the private sector in China, I'm sure, is looking at this as possible business opportunities. Could you elaborate a little bit on how the private sector is gearing up to try to benefit and contribute to these markets?
Sure, Francis. So yeah, in my mind, I would like to look at separately compliance companies and no compliance companies, because they will play different roles in the market. And for compliance companies to be covered by this directly, in my mind, the ETS will definitely incentivize their low carbon technology innovation and to decarbonize their production process with better management skills and structure, and also to improvement the data management. And if they do well in markets, trading markets, they can have additional revenue from carbon trading. That's for compliance companies. But for no compliance companies, they mainly provide supportive services. I just see a lot of new opportunities to be created. For example, they do trading. They can have a big revenue from speculative trading operation. And they can also provide consultation services in carbon asset management. And they can innovate carbon financial services, which is happening in China now. And they can do some technical facilitate services. For example, they are helping now some Chinese startups are helping big group corporations to develop big data carbon management system. Finally, and I think in future, the third-party verification services will be underscored and to ensure the data quality. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Wang. It's interesting. Indeed, it's not just the companies who will have to participate in this market, either compulsory or voluntarily, but it's likely that there's a whole ecosystem of service companies around those markets that are going to emerge, and it'll be very interesting to see how that evolves in China. Dida, Indonesia is very close behind China in setting up its market. Where do you see this going?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So for the next ETS, we hope that some industrial subsector will be ready. So the most ready ones is the pulp and paper, fertilizer, and steel. So hopefully, within 1 or 2 years, they will join the ETS. And the other, we still try to find out how the line sector also to be involved in the ETS, perhaps in the offset mechanism. So that's in Indonesia plan for the right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dida. I wanted to move to Thailand and Dr. Mohanjit, because Thailand also has a fairly sophisticated system. Dr. Mohanjit, you mentioned work on several sectors, including in cities. Could you elaborate a little bit on what is being done with cities and where do you see this going, and whether I'm aware of one city in India that has managed to obtain carbon credit, but is that the ambition in Thailand, and what's the timeline you think for cities to try to tap onto carbon markets?
Now some mitigation projects of the city, such as solar cell, solar rooftop, or LED replacement of the city can apply for T-World, and they can issue the credit. And some city can sell credit to the buyer who would like to offset their emission. So now we have a domestic carbon credit in Thailand, and we have a timeline to scale up the activities of the city to the province that have a large scale of activities, such as waste management, wastewater management, or transportation, and they can have much more greenhouse gas reduction and much more credit.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Mohanjit. I like this exploration of different sectors, and maybe we can go to Vietnam, where Dr. Wang talked about the solid waste management sector, which is a very important sector, again, for municipalities, but in the carbon market overall. And there's first a question from Putti asking whether pilot ETS are voluntary or mandatory. I imagine this question is about Vietnam. So if you could answer that question first, Dr. Wee, and then elaborate on how you see the solid waste management sector participating in this market, particularly since in Vietnam, I understand that much of the solid waste management activities are being pushed to the private sector by the central government. Over to you, Dr. Wee.
Yeah, thank you, Francis. Well, I think I don't know if I got your question right, but I understand that the participant asked me about the solid waste sector involvement within the CPI's application in Vietnam. Well, during the course of the Vietnam PMR project, that what we did for the solid waste sector is to first of all develop a database management system which collect the data from the landfills in Vietnam. That we have hundreds of landfills, but we can only collect from some big ones, mostly from big cities in Vietnam, so but quite a few of them anyway. And with the analysis that, of course, that the solid waste sector may not get involved with the ETS in the future, but rather than that they would join the national crediting mechanism. And that's a number of CPI suggested or proposed for the solid waste sector there. And we also develop the MRV system in full for the solid waste sector. And but currently the option is still open, because we can separate a number of activities that implemented by solid waste sector, which including the activities that because the solid waste sector is using different type of technologies to handle the waste, the solid waste. So some activities can actually be considered as carbon credit generated, from there. So we don't know yet. The frank answer is we don't know yet that if they will be fully joining the national crediting mechanism in the future, or some part of it can join the ETS as they are ready or appropriate for that. I hope that addressed the questions. Thank you.
Yes, very well. Thank you. It's actually a big question on many sectors. How do you actually link them to ETS market? And maybe the solution you found for Vietnam, which is to make them participate in the national crediting system, is either an intermediary step or the right way to go. There's a question from Ashraf El Arani, who's been working on PMR for several years, and his main question, and I think it's a question for everyone, but we can start with you, Ms. Alvarez, since you haven't spoken yet. His main question is, what has made your readiness activities most successful? What are the elements you think are fundamental in the success of establishing carbon finance mechanisms? Over to you.
Do you want me to start? I think the question for everyone.
No, let's move to Paola, and then we'll move to you, Dr. Wei.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, I was going to clarify also who you want to go first. So for the Philippines, I think what was important was really to capacitate the stakeholders, especially in relation to energy. We had to have a lot of briefing in relation to local legislators as well as the senators, since right now with the pandemic, not a lot of things are going on that's positive. So you don't want to spike up prices of commodities because of carbon pricing instruments, but at the same time we had to explain to them that it is actually a long-term planning process, and that if we do want to become a resilient and more low carbon developed country, then we really have to start with the basics, like the foundations. How do you establish an efficient carbon trading mechanism? How do you establish a monitoring facility? So this is where we are as of the moment. So we're looking into how to increase investments through the use of carbon pricing instruments, while at the same time lowering your carbon emissions through limiting the number of coal power plants. So it was also because of the analytics paper that we made that the Department of Energy ultimately decided to announce a moratorium on new coal-fired power plants. And it was because of this that we also started to move energy investments. So now the Philippine government has a project with the ADB to buy out the existing coal-fired power plants in Mindanao, and we will be using sustainable finance to finance the Angus Pulangi hydropower plant. And in the future, because we have been laying down the foundations now, we will then use the ETS mechanisms to further increase investments in renewable energy. So these are all moving parts, but it's important for us to first understand and lay down the foundations of how do we do it efficiently. So that's it for the Philippines.
So good analytics, and then engaging at the political level to convince senators and members of Congress that what is the right way forward. Let's move to Dr. Wei, and then after him, Mr. Wang. Dr. Wei?
Yes, thank you, Francis. For Vietnam, from our research and experience, and when we implemented the PMR project, is first of all, it's a nature for Vietnam here that everything happens when you have a legal documents in place. That's why that we've been pushing quite a bit on the carbon pricing to be included in the law and environmental protection, and it's quite good timing that what the law was developed during the process of implementing the projects. So we succeeded in that, but the law is just the first step. And the second step, as I mentioned during my presentation, is developing a very detailed technical guidance for sector and for land ministries involved in operating or the carbon market or ETS in Vietnam. And another equally important thing is to improve awareness and perception of private sector, which we started to do now, really, from some simple activities such as the consultation workshop. But we want to go in the next step. We want to go deeper to go directly to working with large emitters, which we identify within the law. And for the future, near future, we want to set up a wider forum using the web portal or information system to ensure that the fast and real time the information sharing and experience sharing among the stakeholders as well, to catch up with other countries and with the trend in the world now. Yeah, thank you.
The legal foundations, the technical guidelines, and then of course awareness. I think these are the key three words. Mr. Wang, over to you, and then we'll go to Pak Dida for Indonesia.
Thank you, Francis. What's most important readiness in mind is data, and according MRV system. PMR support China to develop MRV regulation standards, and Chinese government pays great attention on this since 2013. Chinese government has been requiring advisors to report their education mission every year. And right now, if you look back at this data, while they are still not enough, they do provide good basis for example, benchmark calculation of allowance allocation. The Chinese experts use a lot of this data to calculate a sectoral benchmark. And I believe when markets start to operate, this data will give market more confidence about the value of carbon offset. And besides, I would not doubt later the data will be linked to the goal of carbon neutrality of China. So you see, I think, from past experiences and look onward, we will, we'll keep priorities on data quality.
Thank you, Mr. Wang. So data and establishing MRV systems are fundamental, were fundamental elements in setting up ETS. And yes, and this is a never-ending task. So let's see how things evolve. Pak Dida, over to you.
Thank you for the questions. I think the most important ones to the PMR program is, as I mentioned before, the PMR become the platform for all stakeholders to discuss, to develop the concept of carbon pricing in Indonesia. So internally, all the stakeholders in Indonesia have been involved in the discussion of carbon pricing instrument talks, and not only for all Indonesian, but also with our development partner. So that's why I'm also engaged with some other international organizations like OECD, ADB, GGI, particularly for exercising Article 6. So I think, PMR has opened the channel to have a cooperation and developing the program and policy related to carbon pricing in Indonesia.
Thank you. Thank you, Dida. Stakeholder involvement is, of course, fundamental. I think we're all discovering other markets are going to emerge at the same time. So we might as well discover things together. Last but not least, Dr. Wang, the main element of success in Thailand, how would you characterize them?
For Thailand PMR, actually we have many factors, such as we have the market readiness proposal with clear objectives, clear outputs and outcomes that we need, and details of each activity. And I think close supervision of each component is very important. We set up the supervisory committee for each component of the PMR, and we have technical meeting and consultation meetings every 2 months for monitoring progress of work. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very well-structured market. I have one last question, and again, I'd like to go through each one of the speakers, maybe in the same order, starting with you, Ms. Alvarez. And of course, in the Philippine market is only emerging, but a lot of question about how local markets are going to connect with international markets. Do you see this happening, or do you think that will still take quite a while? It's a difficult question, so don't all feel like you have to give an answer. If you don't know, just say, I don't know. Over to you.
I think that would ultimately depend on how developed the markets would be. For example, in Southeast Asia alone, we're not even in the same level of market readiness as of the moment. But of course, we are positive that in the future we would be able to create these types of platforms to trade carbon emissions. That's sufficient.
Thank you. We lost you for a little bit there, but I think you get the gist of your response. Yeah, there's a lot of imbalances, and different countries are at different levels. So we'll see how markets evolve overall. Let's move to Dr. Wee and then Mr. Wang. Over to you, Dr. Wee.
Okay, thank you. From our point of view, well, we actually didn't got much information. I mean, well, only within a small group of people who are working on this field for a number of years, that we would have more information compared to other within the government system. So from our point of view is that the future international market is still very much uncertain. Within UNFCCC, for example, we don't know yet what would come out of Article 6 implementation. And even though we very much expect that Vietnam can be beneficiary out of that, and there's already a number of initiatives to buy the credits from Vietnam, and also that the perspectives of setting up domestic ETS, and that can actually benefit from the crediting mechanism outside the ETS that we expect to have as well. But all those things very much new and uncertain to us. So what we would expect that, well, let's see by end of this year or maybe next year, that the overall picture would be clearer, and that would have a massive influence on our policy development in Vietnam, and also how we treat multilateral and bilateral cooperation on CPIs in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent summary. We are all waiting to know what's going to emerge. I think there's a commission led by McCartney, and results will be presented at in Glasgow if the COP takes place. Mr. Wang, of course, China is a massive market in and of itself. Not sure it actually needs to connect with the rest of the world, but do you think this is part of the one eventual goal, or at this time this has not been discussed? And again, you are from the private sector, so it's not, you don't represent the government, but your opinion is always interesting.
Thanks for your understanding. Yeah, Yeah, sure. From perspective of private sector, I'm not expecting that will occur in the context of China, because as you said, China markets will be a massive market, so it's a huge amount of emissions. So when facing this huge market, I doubt that will be easy to have a unified standards of credit, and to have multilateral recognized allowance allocation plan, etc. So yeah, I mean, it will take a long time to say this kind of situation. But for some specific sector, for example, aviation, because now ICO is discussing aviation trading issue, and of course, yeah, some cross-border aviation future, maybe that will be a breakthrough to have some multinational arrangements.
That's a very good point. Aviation, shipping, maybe sectors that are interested in an international market. Let's move to Pak Dida, and then we'll finish with Dr. Muanjit. Pak Dida, any insights on whether Indonesia is looking at international market, or whether the objective is first to create a national market?
Yeah, thanks. The common ones, domestic market and international market, is we are preparing the same modalities, stakeholders engagement, and also the MRV system, as well as the institutional arrangement. So if we already completed for the modalities for the carbon market domestic, so I think just 1 or 2 more steps to engage in the international carbon trades. Right now, we are exercising Article 6, with support by ADB and GGI. So hopefully, while we still waiting for the result of the consensus Article 6 in Glasgow this year, yeah, we prepare for the some probably the potential of mechanism for this international carbon market.
Thank you, Pak Dida. Of course, we in multilateral agencies and development agencies were very keen to see this connection, because this would enable funding from rich producers, rich companies in the north to finance programs in the south. But let's see if we can crack that nut. So last but not least, Dr. Muanjit, in Thailand, is there an interest or in connecting to international market, or at this stage it's mostly the national market?
Yes, in Thailand updated NDC 2020, it stated that Thailand will continue to explore the potential of bilateral, regional, and international market-based cooperation, including in the context of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we are getting to the end of this PMR webinar, and as I promised at the beginning of the webinar, we've had an illustrator drawing her views or her impression of this webinar via email. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you did, Fernanda?
Yes, of course. So as all the speakers were presenting and then exchanging their views in the Q&A, I was listening for key points and in some moments also points of agreement, connections. So when you have an opportunity to see my visual summary, it will be not necessarily a word by word or a verbatim expression of it, but more of a summary and a distillation of the key messages and recurring points that were discussed in the meeting in a very visual way.
Yeah, in a very visual way. Thank you. We'll send it to all the participants, and it's probably an image we'll keep when presenting the PMR in the future. Usually those illustrations are extremely useful. At this stage, I want to thank all our speakers, Mr. Wang, Pak Dida, Dr. Muanjit, Ms. Alvarez, Dr. Wee, for your insight and your really interesting presentation and for answering the questions. I think I personally learned a lot about the evolution of carbon market in the region. I think Ms. Alvarez summarized it well in saying that there are big differences. Countries are at different level, but what's interesting to see is that we're all working in the same direction, and there's a clear acceleration in the different processes and program. And I think it's only judicious that we are now moving from the PMR, the Program for Market Readiness, to the PMI, the Program for Market Implementation. We at the World Bank are very keen to continue support this process, and we very much hope that you will continue to call on our support. So I want to thank everybody for participating. We're right on time. Thank you for the organizer. Thank you, Rinali. Thank you, Taisei. Thank you, Ashraf and others. And hopefully we'll connect or maybe see each other in person very soon. Please stay safe and good luck in all of your program. Thank you very much.